The hospital hallway was unusually quiet that morning. Even the nurses spoke in softer voices, as if the walls themselves were listening. At the end of the private wing, guarded by two uniformed officers, a single room had become the center of attention for weeks. Inside that room lay the only daughter of one of the most respected military generals in the country. Just 3 months earlier, she had been full of energy. She loved early morning runs with her father. She laughed loudly, argued confidently, and talked about studying science one day. She was strong-minded, just like him. Many people said she carried the same steady look in her eyes. Then the headaches began. At first, no one worried. A busy school schedule, stress, too much time studying. That was what they thought. But within days, the headaches turned into dizziness. The dizziness turned into weakness. One evening, she collapsed at home. The general had carried injured soldiers before. He had seen battlefields. He had faced danger without shaking. But when he picked up his unconscious daughter from the living room floor, his hands trembled in a way they never had before. She was rushed to the best hospital in the city. The first doctors believed it was a simple neurological issue. They ordered scans, blood tests, brain imaging. Everything looked mostly normal. It could be a rare migraine disorder. One specialist suggested. Medication was given. She did not improve. Instead, new symptoms appeared. Her speech became slow. Her hands sometimes shook. She complained that the room felt like it was spinning even when she lay still. Some days, she could barely sit up. The general refused to accept uncertainty. He contacted experts across the country. Within 2 weeks, more specialists arrived. Neurologists, immunologists, infectious disease experts. Each one studied her charts carefully. Each one believed they might be the one to solve it. But every new test only created more confusion. Maybe it is autoimmune, one doctor said. Possibly a rare neurological inflammation. Another offered. There is a small chance of a genetic condition, someone else added. Treatments were adjusted. Stronger medications were introduced. Her body grew weaker. The hospital room slowly changed from hopeful to tense. Machines hummed beside her bed. Charts filled with notes. The whiteboard outside her room listed nearly 30 doctors who had consulted on her case. 30, and still no answers. The general spent most nights sitting beside her bed. He rarely went home. His uniform was replaced with simple clothes, but his posture remained straight, as if he were still on duty. The only difference was his eyes. They looked tired. He would hold her hand and speak gently. He told her stories from his training days. He reminded her how brave she had always been. Sometimes she smiled faintly. Sometimes she simply stared at the ceiling. The media began to whisper about it. Not openly, but quietly. People talked about how even power and influence could not control everything. The general ignored the noise. His focus was only on the bed in front of him. Weeks passed. One afternoon, during a large case meeting, several senior doctors gathered around a long table. Charts were projected onto a screen. Test results were reviewed again and again. We have ruled out infection, one said. Brain scans remain unchanged, another added. Her body is reacting, but we cannot find the trigger. A third admitted. The room fell silent. No one wanted to say what they were all thinking. They were running out of options. Outside, hospital life continued as usual. Stretchers moved through hallways. Visitors carried flowers. Staff members hurried from one floor to another. Among them was a quiet single father who worked in hospital maintenance. His job was simple. He checked equipment, repaired broken outlets, monitored air systems, and made sure machines worked properly. Most people barely noticed him. He liked it that way. After losing his wife several years earlier, he had focused all his energy on raising his young son. He worked long shifts and picked up extra hours whenever possible. His life was structured and steady. Work, home, help with homework, repeat. He had seen many hospital rooms, many patients. Some recovered, some did not. Over time, he learned to observe without interfering. But even he could feel that something about the general's daughter's case was different. The private wing had become tense. Security officers stood near the door. Doctors walked in and out with serious expressions. Machines were added to the room almost every week. One afternoon, he was assigned to check a monitor that had briefly malfunctioned near her room. As he worked quietly by the wall, he noticed how pale she looked. Her father sat beside her, reading something softly, his voice low and calm. The maintenance worker tried not to stare. It was not his place. Still, he noticed things. He noticed that sometimes, shortly after certain equipment was adjusted, her coughing became worse. He noticed how often the air system in that wing seemed to run louder than usual. He noticed small details most people ignored because they were focused on lab results and reports. He did not think much of it at first. Doctors were far more educated than he was. He fixed wires and vents. They saved lives. But something in his memory stirred. Years ago, his own son had become mysteriously sick in their old apartment. It had started with headaches too, then weakness. Doctors back then had struggled to find the cause. It turned out to be something no one expected. He shook the thought away. This was different. This was a major hospital with top specialists. Still, over the next few days, he paid closer attention. The girl's condition seemed to rise and fall in patterns. On certain days, she appeared slightly better. On others, dramatically worse. He began quietly noting the timing in his head. Equipment maintenance, air circulation checks, medication adjustments. He told himself he was overthinking. Meanwhile, inside the room, the general faced a different battle. One evening, after another long discussion with doctors, he stood alone by the window. The city lights flickered outside. He had commanded troops through uncertainty before, but this felt different. In the military, even when outcomes were unclear, there was always a plan. Here, there was only waiting. He turned back toward the bed and saw his daughter struggling just to lift a glass of water. He stepped forward quickly to help her. She gave him a small, tired smile. "I'm okay," she whispered, though she clearly wasn't. That night, after most visitors left, the hospital hallway grew quiet again. The maintenance worker passed by once more, finishing his shift. He glanced toward the guarded door. He saw the general sitting upright in a chair, refusing to sleep. For a brief second, their eyes met. The general nodded politely, a simple gesture of acknowledgement to someone who worked there. The maintenance worker nodded back and continued walking. Neither of them knew that their paths were slowly moving towards something unexpected. Inside the conference room the next morning, the doctors made a difficult decision. They would try one more advanced treatment option. It was experimental, but safe. There were few alternatives left. Consent forms were signed. The general did not hesitate. Anything that might help his daughter was worth trying. As the new treatment began, hope flickered again, fragile but present. But deep down, in quiet corners of the hospital, there was a growing feeling no one wanted to admit. Something was being missed. Not because the doctors were careless, not because they lacked skill, but because sometimes, when everyone looks at the same problem from the same angle, they all overlook what is right in front of them. And in the background of machines humming and footsteps echoing, a quiet single father continued doing his job, unaware that soon he would face a choice. Stay silent like everyone else, or speak up about something that did not feel right. For now, the general's daughter lay still under the soft hospital lights. 30 doctors had tried, and still, no one could explain why she was getting worse. The quiet single father had worked in the hospital for years. He knew every hallway, every machine, every corner of the ventilation systems. He moved through the building each day almost like a ghost. People barely noticed him. That was fine. He preferred it that way. His life was already full. After losing his wife, raising his son alone had become his entire world. He focused on simple routines, work, and being there for his child. No one could argue that he did not work hard. Yet, even with everything he had learned from experience, he never imagined he would become involved in something so delicate and powerful. It was during his routine check of the rooms in the private wing that he began to notice patterns. He had been assigned to repair a small monitor machine near the general's daughter's room. As he worked, he watched her from a distance. She was pale, her hand weakly gripping the edge of the blanket. Her father sat beside her chair, silent, occasionally brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. The scene was heartbreaking, but it was not unfamiliar to him. He had seen patients in quiet suffering before. What caught his attention was subtle. A slight increase in coughing whenever certain equipment was adjusted. The flicker of discomfort when the air vents above her bed hummed in an unusual rhythm. He paused and watched, thinking it might be coincidence. Maybe it was the timing of the medication, or the natural ups and downs of her condition. But something in his mind clicked. Years ago, his own son had suffered a sudden illness with symptoms that confused every doctor. After weeks of frustration, he discovered it was caused by mold hidden in the walls of their old apartment. The symptoms were eerily similar: weakness, headaches, confusion, and delayed responses. He remembered the helplessness, the fear of not knowing, the endless cycle of tests that led nowhere. Now, he wondered, could there be something similar here, hidden in plain sight? He began paying closer attention. Every day after his official maintenance tasks, he would pause by her room. He would watch how she reacted to changes in the room, how her breathing altered with airflow, how her expression shifted during brief noises from machines. He did not interfere. He did not speak up yet. He wrote notes in his mind, piecing together a puzzle only he seemed to notice. He was careful. No one could accuse him of meddling because he simply observed. The general continued to spend every moment by his daughter's side. His military discipline never left him, but even he was struggling. Every doctor had offered their opinion. Every treatment had failed. His daughter's strength continued to decline. He had been told to expect the worst, yet he could not let go. Every small rise in her temperature, every subtle movement of her hand, he noted like a commander tracking his soldiers. He refused to leave. At night, he would sit beside her bed, sometimes reading quietly, sometimes simply watching her chest rise and fall. He could not rest. The maintenance worker's observations grew more detailed. He noted that her symptoms seemed to worsen shortly after certain vents were activated. It was not obvious at first. The changes were small. A faint wheeze, a subtle pallor, a slight increase in coughing. Any ordinary person might ignore it, but his experience with his son's illness had taught him to notice the unnoticed. He compared the days when she seemed slightly better with days when her energy seemed drained. Slowly, a pattern began to emerge. He began to consider speaking up, but he hesitated. He was not a doctor. 30 highly trained specialists had examined her. Who was he, a simple maintenance worker, to challenge their conclusions? He imagined the reaction he might receive. Dismissal, anger, perhaps even scolding. Yet, the thought of remaining silent while she suffered felt heavier than any risk. One evening, after finishing his work, he lingered near her room. The father, exhausted from months of watching, had dozed off in his chair. She lay quietly under the dim light, barely moving. He remembered the desperation of his own past, how helpless he had felt when his son had been sick, and no one could explain why. He swallowed his fear. Perhaps, he thought, noticing patterns and suggesting ideas is the only way someone might finally be helped. He decided to talk to one of the nurses, someone he had worked with for years and trusted. She was a kind woman, used to hearing odd observations from staff, but also practical and realistic. He approached her carefully, not wanting to cause alarm. "I've noticed something," he began quietly, his voice low. "It may not mean anything, but I think her symptoms get worse when the ventilation system runs in a certain way." The nurse looked at him with polite skepticism. "You mean the air vents? We haven't had any complaints before, and the doctors are already testing everything they can think of. I'm sure it's fine." He nodded, respecting her professionalism. "I just thought I should mention it. I've seen something like this before years ago with my own child." She nodded, gave him a small smile, and went back to her work. She did not dismiss him completely, but neither did she act on his words. He felt a pang of frustration, but also a strange relief. He had spoken. Over the next few days, he continued to observe. He grew more certain that the environment might be affecting her in ways the doctors had not considered. Each small symptom, a tremble, a pause in her breathing, a change in her complexion, seemed linked to unseen factors around her room. Machines and medications were not the issue. Something else was. Meanwhile, the general's exhaustion deepened. His uniform was replaced with casual clothing, but his presence was just as commanding. He tried to maintain hope for his daughter. When she would look up weakly, he would smile and tell her stories of adventure and courage, reminding her of the strength she carried inside. She listened, sometimes offering faint responses, sometimes simply closing her eyes to rest. The hospital staff began to notice the father's unwavering presence. Nurses whispered about his patience, his gentleness, and his determination. It was clear that he would not leave until something changed. Yet, even their admiration could not solve the mystery of her illness. Then came a day when the maintenance worker could no longer ignore what he was seeing. The pattern was undeniable. Her symptoms worsened dramatically after certain periods of vent operation. It was subtle but consistent. No doctor had mentioned the vents. No test had considered environmental exposure. He realized he might be the only person noticing the link. He struggled with his next steps. To speak might upset the doctors. To remain silent might allow her suffering to continue. His mind raced with memories of past helplessness, of nights spent worrying over his son, of endless tests that revealed nothing. He knew what it felt like to watch a loved one decline and feel powerless. He could not let that happen again if there was any chance to prevent it. One morning, after finishing repairs in another wing, he paused outside her room. The general was seated beside the bed, staring at her hand, his face drawn and pale. The daughter moved slightly, attempting to lift her head. The maintenance worker felt a surge of determination. He would speak, carefully, respectfully, and with humility. If nothing else, someone needed to hear what he had observed. He prepared himself to approach one of the doctors. He rehearsed words in his head. He reminded himself to be clear, simple, and focus on what he had seen. He reminded himself that this was not about proving himself right, but about possibly helping a girl who had been suffering for months without answers. His fear remained, but his resolve was stronger. That day, he found an opportunity to speak with a young physician who had been observing her closely. He explained the subtle link he had noticed, how certain airflow changes seemed to coincide with her sudden coughing, increased pallor, and episodes of weakness. He mentioned his past experience with his own son, careful not to exaggerate or claim expertise he did not have. The physician paused, considering his words. No one had suggested environmental exposure. Perhaps it was worth investigating, just to rule it out. The maintenance worker felt a glimmer of hope, but he did not celebrate. He had not yet been heard by the doctors who were leading the case. Still, he felt the weight lift slightly. For the first time, someone might finally look at the problem from a different angle. Someone willing to notice what others might overlook. The general's daughter continued to lie in her bed, unaware of the quiet figure whose observations might one day change everything. And in the hallways, the maintenance worker quietly returned to his work, carrying with him the knowledge that sometimes the smallest voice could become the most important one, even in a room filled with 30 doctors. The quiet single father spent the next few days waiting for a sign that someone would finally listen to his observation, that the subtle patterns he had noticed might be taken seriously. He continued his work as usual, checking machines, fixing outlets, and walking the familiar hallways. But every few minutes, his thoughts returned to the girl in the private wing. Her weakness, the rise and fall of her breathing, the look in her eyes when she tried to lift her hand and failed. It haunted him. He could not ignore it. He had to do something more. He realized the next step was to speak directly with one of the doctors in charge of her case. It was not easy. 30 specialists had already looked at her charts, examined her body, run tests, and discussed treatments. They were brilliant, experienced, and confident. Who was he to suggest something they had not considered? Yet he knew that what he had noticed could not be ignored. The fear of being dismissed battled with the hope that he might help save her life. One morning, as sunlight filtered through the hospital windows, he approached a young physician who was reviewing her charts. The doctor looked up, slightly annoyed at the interruption, but willing to hear him out. The maintenance worker took a deep breath and spoke carefully, keeping his voice low and respectful. He described what he had seen, the pattern between the ventilation system and her worsening symptoms. He spoke about the small, almost invisible signs, slight changes in her color, the coughing fits, the tremors that coincided with airflow changes, the faint discomfort whenever certain vents were active. He reminded the doctor of his past experience with his own son, emphasizing that he was not claiming expertise, only sharing observations from years of careful watching and experience. The doctor listened, curious but skeptical. She knew the girl's condition well and was aware of all the data and test results. Could it really be something as simple as the air? She agreed hesitantly that there was no harm in checking. Even if it was unlikely, it would at least rule out one more possibility. The maintenance worker's hands felt slightly lighter as he realized that someone, even one doctor, was willing to consider his suggestion. The hospital authorized an inspection of the ventilation system in that particular wing. Technicians were called to check every vent, every duct, and every filter. The maintenance worker accompanied them, quietly pointing out small irregularities he had noticed during his observations. Hours passed as they crawled through tight spaces, removed panels, and carefully examined the metal pathways through which air traveled to each room. What they found stunned them. There were small patches of mold hidden in the ducts, patches that had gone unnoticed during routine maintenance. The contamination was subtle but present, enough to affect someone highly sensitive, like the general's daughter. When the findings were reported to the medical team, the room filled with tension. 30 doctors had been searching for a cause, trying every test and treatment. Yet the simple environmental factor had been overlooked. The general was called in to be informed. He listened carefully as the lead physician explained what had been discovered. The air in his daughter's room, compromised by hidden mold, was triggering reactions that mimicked a serious illness. It was rare, almost impossible to detect, and no test could have identified it directly from her body alone. The general's face was a mix of relief, shock, and gratitude. Relief that there was finally an explanation. Shock that such a subtle factor had been missed. Gratitude for the quiet maintenance worker who had dared to speak up. The doctors began to discuss the next steps. Moving her to a clean environment was the first priority, followed by treatment to stabilize her body from the long exposure. The maintenance worker watched quietly from the background, hesitant to take any recognition. His only concern had been helping the girl. Yet, even as he observed the doctor's reactions and the general's intense gratitude, he felt a quiet pride. He had noticed what others had missed. He had spoken despite fear and doubt. And now there was hope. That evening, the general personally approached him. The corridor was empty, the sounds of the hospital subdued. The general looked him in the eye, his expression serious but warm. "Thank you," he said simply. "No one else saw it. No one else considered it. You did. You saved my daughter." The maintenance worker felt a lump in his throat. Words failed him. All he could do was nod, a silent acknowledgement of the weight of those words. The general placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of respect that carried more meaning than any official reward. The next day, the girl was carefully moved to a different room, one with clean air and no exposure to the contaminated vents. Doctors adjusted her treatment plan, the focus on recovery, rather than fighting an unknown cause. Within hours, subtle improvements were visible. Her color returned slightly. Her coughing eased. For the first time in weeks, she seemed more comfortable. It was slow progress, but it was real. It was tangible. It was hope. The maintenance worker continued his work, checking equipment and ensuring the new room remained safe. He had become part of the story, though he remained in the background. The medical team occasionally sought his input on environmental factors, quietly respecting his observations and experience. His courage to speak up had opened a door that no one else had considered. Meanwhile, the general stayed by his daughter's side, watching each small improvement with careful attention. He never missed a moment. His military discipline combined with parental love created a presence that reassured her, even when she could not speak. He would tell her stories, encourage her to take tiny steps towards sitting up, and celebrate each little victory. She responded slowly at first, but her progress was undeniable. Word of the discovery spread quietly through the hospital. Staff members whispered about the maintenance worker, about how an unnoticed perspective had led to a breakthrough. He became known as someone who paid attention, who cared deeply, who was willing to observe and speak despite the risks of being ignored or dismissed. The doctors reflected on the lessons they had learned. Even the most experienced professionals could miss details when they focused solely on their expertise. Sometimes, It was the observations of someone outside the traditional medical hierarchy that could reveal truths hidden in plain sight. They realized the importance of listening, not just to specialists, but to everyone who interacts with patients, noticing the subtle signs that might otherwise be overlooked. As the days passed, the girl's condition continued to stabilize. Her strength returned gradually. She could lift her head without assistance, then her arms, then sit up. Each small achievement brought smiles and relief. The general's hand never left hers for long, and he encouraged her every step of the way. The maintenance worker, though he did not seek recognition, quietly felt a sense of accomplishment. He knew he had made a difference, that his careful observations and courage to speak had changed the course of someone's life. It reminded him of why he remained vigilant in everything he did, why paying attention to the smallest details could have the largest impact. One evening, as he completed his shift, he paused outside the room. The general and his daughter were talking softly, sharing a moment that was private, gentle, and full of gratitude. He walked away quietly, leaving them to their time, but carrying with him the understanding that even in places filled with expertise and authority, a quiet voice could become the most important one. He returned home to his son, who greeted him with a smile and a hug. They had dinner together, spoke about the day, and shared small stories that brought lightness to their lives. The maintenance worker knew that life would continue with its routines, challenges, and responsibilities. But he also knew that his actions had left a lasting impact, a reminder that courage, attention, and compassion could sometimes succeed where knowledge alone could not. And inside the hospital, the girl slept peacefully that night. 30 doctors had tried and failed. Yet, through careful observation, patience, and a willingness to speak up, hope had returned. And somewhere in the background, a quiet man who did not seek praise had made all the difference. The discovery of a hidden mold in the ventilation system changed everything. The medical team moved quickly, understanding that time was precious. The general's daughter was carefully transferred to a new room with clean air and no risk of exposure. Each movement was slow and cautious, ensuring her safety and comfort. Her father followed closely, holding her hand, whispering encouragement and offering support. The hospital staff watched in silence, knowing that what had been discovered could change the course of her life. As the days passed, small improvements became noticeable. Her color returned, her coughs lessened, and her strength slowly began to build. The doctors adjusted their treatment plan, focusing on recovery rather than searching for a mysterious cause. Every day, the girl was able to do a little more, sit up longer, lift her arms, speak in short sentences. The progress was steady and visible, though still fragile. The general watched every movement, noting the subtle improvements and celebrating each one quietly. He had spent weeks feeling helpless, watching the girl he loved suffer, while experts were unable to find the cause. Now, with each small gain, he felt hope returning. The worry in his eyes softened, replaced with cautious optimism. He continued to encourage her, telling her stories, reminding her of her strength, and celebrating every little step toward recovery. The quiet maintenance worker continued his observations in the background, ensuring that the room remained safe and that no other hidden risks were present. He checked the ventilation system regularly, confirmed that the filters were clean, and made sure all equipment functioned correctly. He did not seek attention, though whispers of his role had begun to circulate among hospital staff. They spoke of the man who had noticed something no one else did, whose attention to detail and courage to speak had saved a life. The doctors, once frustrated by their inability to find answers, now reflected on what had happened. They realized that even the most experienced specialists could overlook small but crucial details. Expertise and knowledge were vital, but so was observation, curiosity, and the willingness to consider perspectives outside the traditional hierarchy. They began to see the maintenance worker not as someone outside the professional world, but as a partner in patient care, someone whose insights, though not medically trained, had proven invaluable. The general made a decision. He wanted to formally recognize the man who had saved his daughter, not just for the hospital staff, but in a way that would honor his courage and humility. He arranged a small, private meeting in his daughter's new room. The maintenance worker, unaware of the purpose, arrived to continue his routine checks, expecting only to perform his usual duties. When the general spoke, his voice was steady, warm, and sincere. "I want to thank you," he said. "You saw what others could not. You spoke up when it mattered most. You saved my daughter." The maintenance worker felt his chest tighten. Words failed him, and he could only nod, humbled by the acknowledgement. He had never sought recognition, never imagined he would be praised for simply paying attention and caring. Yet, the general's gratitude was more than words. It was a recognition of courage, compassion, and the power of noticing what others might miss. Over the following weeks, the girl continued to improve. Each day brought new milestones. She could sit up without support, speak longer sentences, and even eat small meals on her own. Her laughter returned slowly, first in whispers, then in small smiles, and eventually in soft giggles that filled the room with life. Her father remained by her side, steadfast, celebrating every victory and providing encouragement through every challenge. The hospital began to implement changes based on the discovery. Air systems in all wings were inspected, maintenance procedures were updated, and staff were encouraged to pay closer attention to environmental factors. The lessons learned from this experience extended beyond one patient, creating a safer environment for everyone. The quiet maintenance worker, still humble and reserved, became a valued part of the hospital team in a new capacity, ensuring that hidden risks would not be overlooked again. As the girl grew stronger, she began to express curiosity about the world outside her hospital room. She asked questions about the ventilation system, about how the mold had affected her, and about the man who had noticed what everyone else had missed. She listened with wide eyes as her father explained how small details could make a huge difference, how paying attention and speaking up could save lives, and how courage came in many forms, not always loud or obvious. The maintenance worker smiled quietly, realizing that his role had gone beyond observation and action. He had inspired understanding, reflection, and even hope. He saw the girl's progress as a reminder that attention to detail and care for others could create meaningful change, even in a world filled with experts, technology, and protocols. The general watched as his daughter began to regain not just her health, but her spirit. He reflected on the past weeks, the fear, the uncertainty, the helplessness he had felt. He understood now that true strength came from collaboration, humility, and recognizing the value in every perspective, no matter how unexpected. He had seen firsthand that sometimes the quietest voice could be the most powerful. One evening, as the hospital corridors grew quiet, the maintenance worker completed his final checks of the room. He paused to look at the girl, who was reading a small book with her father beside her. She looked up, smiled softly, and waved. He nodded, returning the gesture, feeling a warmth in his heart that he had not expected. His work had mattered. His observation had made a difference. He had been a small part of the story that changed a life. As he left the room, he walked through the hallways, carrying with him the knowledge that courage, attention, and compassion could create miracles. 30 doctors had tried and failed, but one quiet single father, simply paying attention, had seen what everyone else had missed. His actions had restored health, hope, and life to someone who had seen beyond saving. The girl's recovery continued steadily. She began to plan for the future, inspired by her own experience. She spoke about studying health and the environment, determined to help others who might face similar challenges. Her father encouraged her curiosity, proud of the resilience and courage she had developed. The hospital staff watched in quiet admiration, inspired by the story that unfolded in their midst. And in the background, the maintenance worker continued his work, quietly ensuring that the environment remained safe, aware that sometimes the smallest observations could make the greatest difference. He had learned that paying attention, caring deeply, and speaking up when it mattered could save a life. And in doing so, he had become a part of something far larger than himself, a story of hope, perseverance, and the power of noticing what others might overlook. The girl's recovery continued steadily, and the hospital slowly returned to its normal rhythm. Machines hummed quietly, nurses walked through the hallways, and visitors came and went. But the memory of the days when she was critically ill remained in the minds of everyone who had been involved. For the general, it was a constant reminder of how fragile life could be and how quickly circumstances could change. The general decided to formally honor the man who had noticed a hidden problem. He wanted the recognition to reflect not just the action itself, but the courage, care, and humility that had guided it. A small ceremony was arranged in the hospital conference room. The maintenance worker arrived, unaware of the event's significance, expecting only to continue his usual tasks. When the general addressed the staff and expressed his gratitude, the maintenance worker's heart pounded. He had never sought recognition, and yet, in that moment, he felt the weight of his actions recognized in a way he had never anticipated. "You saw what others could not," the general said. "You paid attention when everyone else was focused elsewhere. Your care, your courage, and your voice made the difference between despair and hope. You saved my daughter." The room was silent. The doctors, nurses, and staff who had once doubted or overlooked the small details now understood the power of observation and humility. They applauded softly, but the focus remained on the quiet man who had quietly ensured her recovery. He nodded, humbled, feeling a sense of pride he had never expected. He had simply done what he thought was right. The girl's health continued to improve. She could now walk slowly with assistance, feed herself, and even engage in conversations with her father. Each step, each word, each smile was a victory, a sign of the resilience she had shown throughout her ordeal. Her laughter returned, first in soft giggles and eventually in full, joyous sound that filled the room with warmth. The general watched with deep pride, recognizing the strength and courage in his daughter that had always been there. The hospital staff began to see the broader lessons from the experience. Protocols were revised to include more careful attention to environmental factors, inspections of air systems, and input from all staff members, not just those with medical training. The maintenance worker, though humble and reserved, became an integral part of the hospital's approach to patient safety. His actions had shown that attention, care, and willingness to speak up were just as important as expertise. The girl became curious about the events that had led to her recovery. She asked her father questions about the mold, the air systems, and the man who had noticed what everyone else had missed. She listened carefully as he explained, emphasizing the importance of observation, patience, and courage. Her eyes sparkled with newfound curiosity, and she began to dream of ways to help others, inspired by her own experience. Her father continued to support her, both physically and emotionally. He guided her recovery, encouraged her learning, and celebrated each milestone. He reflected on the lessons he had learned, that humility, collaboration, and openness to unexpected insights could be as powerful as authority and experience. He understood now that leadership and care were not always about knowing everything, but about recognizing the value in every perspective. The maintenance worker continued his daily routine, quietly ensuring the hospital remained safe and functional. He was no longer just a background figure. He had become a symbol of vigilance, patience, and the power of quiet observation. Though he never sought the spotlight, his colleagues respected and valued his contributions more than ever. They saw that courage often came in quiet, unassuming forms, and that small actions could have profound effects. The girl's life gradually returned to a sense of normalcy. She resumed her studies, played with friends, and enjoyed simple pleasures that had seemed impossible months earlier. Her curiosity about health and the environment grew stronger. She began to ask thoughtful questions, eager to learn more about the world and how to prevent suffering for others. Her father encouraged this interest, proud that she had transformed her own experience into a desire to help. The hospital reflected on the story for years to come. It became an example of how collaboration, attention to detail, and respect for all contributions could lead to solutions that might otherwise be overlooked. Doctors and staff shared the story with new employees, emphasizing that expertise alone was not enough, and that sometimes the quietest voice could be the most important. The lessons learned extended far beyond one patient, shaping a culture of care, vigilance, and mutual respect. One evening, after a long day, the maintenance worker returned home to his son. They shared a simple meal, talked about the day, and laughed together. He felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that it made a real difference, that his actions had saved a life, and that his son had seen the value of courage, care, and observation firsthand. Life had returned to routine, but it carried with it the profound knowledge that small acts of attention and bravery could create extraordinary outcomes. The general's daughter continued to grow stronger and more confident. She often spoke of her desire to help others, inspired by the man who had noticed the problem and the doctors who had worked tirelessly to treat her. She understood the importance of observation, patience, and persistence. Her experience became a source of wisdom and inspiration, not just for her family, but for the hospital and community around her. The general remained deeply grateful. He had witnessed firsthand that true strength came from recognizing the value in every perspective, that courage was not always loud, and that care and attention could save lives in ways that knowledge alone could not. He often reflected on the quiet maintenance worker whose humble diligence had made all the difference. Years later, the story of the girl, her recovery, and the quiet man who noticed what 30 doctors had missed became well known in the hospital and among families. It was told as an example of vigilance, courage, and compassion. The lessons endured. Observe carefully, care deeply, speak up when necessary, and recognize the value in all contributions. The maintenance worker continued his life, quietly, with humility and purpose. The girl thrived, her spirit strengthened by her experience, and the general found a renewed understanding of leadership, courage, and the power of listening. The story became a lasting reminder that hope could be restored, life could be saved, and sometimes the quietest voices could change everything.